Well, good afternoon or good evening or good morning, depending where this finds you in the world. I'm Fred Plotkin. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Idagio, the place where classical music happens. Idagio, as you know, is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. As regular listeners know, I tend to invite people on this program who inspire me and whom you will find inspiring. And today's guest certainly fits in that category. It is Harvey Steiman, who is joining us from, I know it may look to you like the Swiss Alps, it's actually Aspen, Colorado, site of a famous music festival. So Harvey, welcome.
Great to be here. Oh yeah, I'm going to. I'll pour my wine in a minute.
Very good.
Whenever you tell me.
So what I want listeners to know about Harvey is that he is the editor at large emeritus of the Wine Spectator, the world's leading wine magazine. And he joined as managing editor in 1983. And I'm coughing because I have wine here in a hot room. And later became editor at large. And he has covered the entire world in terms of wine, and this has brought him to many places where, coincidentally, opera and classical music are often performed. These things seem to go together wherever I go for festivals. There tends to be a very strong food and wine component. And you started covering wine and food in 1973 in Miami, but you are from California. You have had radio programs, television programs. You live in San Francisco with your wife, Carol, whom I know. And it's hard to say whether you and I overlap more for wine, for food, for opera and classical music, or baseball. Which would you say?
I think I'd put it under the heading that you like to put it, pleasure.
Pleasure.
All of those things bring me pleasure and pain, depending on how well they're done or whether the teams we support are doing well. But yeah, I'm in the same game.
Let me get right to a point that you just sort of tipped your hand at. Is it a good thing or an inevitable thing to permanently have on one's critical faculties, or sometimes is it time to turn them off?
Yeah, I think I know where you're getting at. I like being able to know the difference between things that I'm experiencing, to know what it should be versus what it is, or what I prefer and what it is. On the other hand, I can shut that off to some extent, unless it's painful. I mean, if someone's playing terribly out of tune, I have a problem appreciating that. But if they're hitting all the technical notes as well as they can, it's okay to miss a thing every now and then. That's part of live performance. But if they're giving me something special that I haven't had before, whether it's food or a singer or an orchestra or a string quartet or a baseball team, I can appreciate it. And I think that's, and it brings me pleasure.
I try whenever possible to resolutely turn off my critical faculties and allow myself to experience things without the filter of prior experience and not compare, because I could be listening to a wonderful Violetta in La Traviata and say, well, yes, she's great, but she's not doing what Renata Scotto, Ileana Kotru-Bosch, Maria Callas, you name your Violetta, did. And I don't necessarily want to be in that framework. I'd rather understand what is she doing, or if I'm approaching a glass of wine, yes, I could say that this is Sauvignon Blanc Grape. How do I compare it to others, or how do I receive it on its own? Where do you stand on that?
I can compare it to others, but I don't expect it to be what others have given me. I want something that no one else has given me before, if I can get it, and that applies to all the things we've been talking about.
So When people ask me about baseball, I refer to it as my other religion. And
Yeah,
I let people try to figure out what my first religion is, which can be any number of things. But do you know what I mean by my other religion, and how would you describe it?
yeah, I think I know what you mean. I'll tell you a little anecdote. I was in Australia visiting a friend of mine who is one of the leading wine writers in Australia. And we happened to have attended a wine tasting at the Melbourne Cricket Ground, which is the Yankee Stadium of Australia. Hallowed grounds for anybody who is a cricket fan. And I kind of understood the basics of cricket, but I had never really understood the nuances. And we sat and watched for about an hour. And he was explaining to me what they were doing and why they were doing it. I kept asking him questions. And by the end of the hour, I had a pretty good idea. I actually surprised him that I could make a comment about strategy that he didn't expect an American to be able to make. But he referred to himself as a cricket tragic. And I think both of us are baseball tragics in that we're going to go there, whether it's painful or exciting or whatever. It's because it's rewarding in some level for us.
Well, I know that soccer is referred to as the beautiful game, or as it's called in most of the world, football. And this weekend, there'll be the Copa America between Argentina and Brazil. And then on Sunday, it will be Italy versus England at Wembley Stadium for the youth of the European Championship. And I love these sports and I will watch them. But to me, baseball is really the beautiful game. And I know that many people in other countries don't necessarily get it. They do in Japan, they do in Korea, they do in much of Latin America, and they do in Italy, actually. Because I don't know if you know that in Italy, when American troops in World War II were stationed there, many of them were stationed near Parma and near Grosseto, and taught baseball to the Italians, so that the Parma and Grosseto teams tend to be the best in Italy. And Italians do kind of get it, although it's not at the level there of basketball or certainly soccer. But to me, to understand the best of America, and we have plenty that needs improvement, but the best of America comes in understanding the values and the approaches of baseball. And I find it very similar to opera in that it has its own time frame. It has its own protagonism, that everybody at a certain point has a solo, but then there are choral parts. And to me, it neatly fits in without having to exaggerate or find a concept. Explain, if you would, from your point of view, baseball, not only as an American thing, but as something that people who love opera would appreciate.
One time I was standing outside of what was then Pacific Bell Park in San Francisco with a good friend who was, we were attending the opening game, the opening day. This must have been 20 years ago. And he said, "Why do you love baseball so much?" And my answer then, and I think it's still my answer, is the game is exquisitely balanced. There are moments when you can go from glory to tragedy with one swing of the bat, hit or miss. And the way the game is constructed, the 90 feet apart bases, the pitcher's mound 60 feet 6 inches from home plate, that's a structure that to me is very similar to the structure of opera, where there are instrumentalists, there are singers, and they're trying to balance sound, story, character, in a way that I find endlessly fascinating. And you can appreciate every element of it, just the way you can appreciate every element of baseball. But you don't have to. You can just go there and listen to the music. You can go to a baseball game and wait for someone to hit a home run. You don't have to be deep into it to enjoy the experience. But I think the same thing with opera.
There's also the fact that baseball, in many places where it's played, it's referred to as a park. And there's a garden element to it. It's very green, it's very verdant. We sit surrounding it. Often it's like opera or theater in the round. It's different from certain kinds of games that is about the claiming and the sacrifice of territory, like football,
Yeah.
rugby, basketball, hockey, soccer. Um, Baseball has its own geography. Baseball
Mhm.
is not on the clock either. So if in
Yeah, it's the
opera
pay.
the applause
It,
goes longer or someone sings more slowly, it goes longer. If they perform quickly, it goes shorter. Baseball never ends at the same time. There's no clock.
correct. That's true, and also the pace of baseball drives some people nuts because it isn't fast enough. But I think we enjoy it because there's time to think about it. It's the same with opera. There's time to think about what they just did and what's going to happen next.
There's also the drama that unless there's a terrible weather incident or an earthquake, they don't stop the game until it's done.
Yeah.
So therefore, there is a certain degree of suspense. It's supposed to go 9 innings, which are frames. But if the score is tied, it's not that they have penalty bats and a home run competition. You keep playing, and that kind of suspense is also thrilling. Now,
I
Harvey,
agree.
there's also the thing that you and I have partaken of together in San Francisco is that there's the culinary and beverage element of baseball that
Yep.
is, yes, we have it to some degree in opera, but it's different. You have during intervals, during intermissions, you may go for a meal in opera festivals in Salzburg or Bayreuth, or a quick bite at the Met or San Francisco Opera. But in baseball, you could eat during. This may
Yeah.
eventually come back to opera where it was 200 years ago.
And they used
where
to
you
do
could
that
eat.
in Italy in years
Yeah, of
past.
course, and in Austria always.
Yeah.
But what you and I have done better in San Francisco than in New York is eaten. Now, talk about traveling around the country. You and I have been known to go to different stadiums or
Mhm.
ballparks, and we're very conversant in the food offerings in these places. I'm a New York Yankee fan, but the food is terrible. I'm embarrassed to say that New York City, with this great culinary tradition, that the food is so bad and expensive at Yankee Stadium. Whereas in San Francisco, it's not, I wouldn't say the best in baseball, but it's very much higher than New York.
Well, we're glad to have it. It's there are some fun things at the ballpark. Uh, you can get a Latino rice bowl, rice with some grilled chicken on top. You can actually get a New York pizza slice from Tony's, which is actually pretty reasonably good. It's not the best pizza you've ever had, but it's a New York slice. It's a recognizable New York slice. It is
3 hours
go-to.
behind.
Yeah, well, they do bake them fresh, and and there's some interesting offerings that are at the ballpark, and I really like the way they've upped the game on beer in the last few years. They still haven't gotten very far on wine, but at least there's some good craft beers that are available at the ballpark. But I mean, traditionally, baseball, you went to a baseball game, you had a hot dog and a beer. But
I never
today,
did.
there are more options.
I never did. Growing up in New York with my father, or let's explain to listeners. Harvey lives in San Francisco, where the team is the San Francisco Giants.
Okay.
Until the late 1950s, they were the New York Giants. They played in Manhattan, my borough. In Los Angeles, where I believe you grew up, there are the Los Angeles Dodgers. They were, until the late 1950s, the Brooklyn Dodgers. And in the glory era of baseball in the 1950s, it had been integrated. Black ball players and Latino ball players were coming in. And the Dodgers were the first, actually, with Jackie Robinson, Roy Campanella, and others. And the Giants quickly after, and the Yankees too. We in New York had 3 teams: the Yankees in the Bronx, the Giants in Manhattan, and the Dodgers in Brooklyn. It's a bit like London with its soccer teams, having so many teams. And at that time, California
We're
was
competing opera houses.
and competing opera houses. We had many.
Yeah.
And therefore, California, which didn't have professional baseball teams, became an attraction with its huge markets. And so the Giants moved to San Francisco, and my father was a Giants fan, and that put him in permanent mourning and actually prompted a trip to San Francisco in 1962 to see Willie Mays, their great player, play in what was then Candlestick Park, very windy. Mm-hmm. And my mother's family were Dodger fans. So I come from what I call a mixed marriage, yep, in that they were Giants and Dodger fans. And I, for Solomonic reasons, could not take the side of one or the other. So I opted for the team that no one rooted for, the fearsome Yankees in the Bronx. I never lived in the Bronx. And there are two leagues in America, the National, where the Giants and the Dodgers play, and the American League, where the Yankees play. So I was both the family outcast, but always, frankly, most of the time had the winning team. The Dodgers won in 65, the Giants in 62, if I remember. But early on, I was a 6 and 7 year old at that time, but all of this was imprinted. I knew all the statistics, all the players. There was a special scorecard that you could fill out that was like a program. And my dad took me to Yankee Stadium gritting his teeth because there were no more Giants for him to take me to, and never fully embraced the Yankees, although he respected them. But I should say something about Yankee Stadium that you began to mention regarding Melbourne, that the old Yankee Stadium was indeed a shrine. It was built in 1923, and we in New York can say that the Metropolitan Opera opened in 1883, Yankee Stadium in 1923. We know these statistics. They're part of our lore. And in the middle of the outfield, in other words, where the players, the further players are to catch the long distance hits, there was an area called Monument Park, I believe. And it was an area beyond the outfield, and kids and their fathers or mothers could go and visit Monument Park. And there were plaques there to the great Yankee heroes, Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and Joe DiMaggio and others. And I must confess that I somehow came to understand that these men were buried there, and that this was indeed hallowed ground, and that we were visiting the tombs of Lou Gehrig and Joe DiMaggio and Babe Ruth and others. And so when they built a new Yankee Stadium, very close to the old one, and it's completely soulless, they had a new Monument Park. And I called the press office and I said, I'm a reporter, I work for New York Public Radio, and I would like to know where the tombs moved from the old park to the new, to Monument Park. And she said, what are you talking about? And I said, are those not the graves? That's what I believed growing up. And she said, well, I know you're a serious person, so maybe, I know you're not teasing me, but maybe you don't know that Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and Joe DiMaggio were never buried in Yankee Stadium. Now, I mention this because, to me, it was Valhalla. It was exactly like the dead heroes of the ring.
Who were the Valkyries?
When I began to learn Wagner in the Ring cycle, my mental note, my mental equivalent was Monument Park, let's call it, in Yankee Stadium. This is how deeply we baseball lovers experience this stuff. And this is one of the many, many ways, even if mistaken, that we connect baseball to opera. Another way, in your case, specifically in San Francisco, is that the San Francisco Opera has a wonderful season every June, and they broadcast in, is it now called AT&T Park, your new stadium?
No, it's currently Oracle Park.
Oracle Park, okay. And there's baseball night at the opera.
Actually, they do that in September. Because
okay.
June is June is baseball season too. September is baseball season, but they do a closed circuit broadcast of one of the opening night operas. Usually, this year it's going to be a special concert that they're calling Homecoming. But it's in early September, when the Giants are on the road, they open the stadium and it's free to anybody who wants to come.
What I mean is not a performance there. What I meant is that they have a live transmission from War Memorial Opera House.
Yes,
in
it's
June.
a live. That's what I meant to say. That is a live transmission from the Opera House. This year it's going to be a concert. Usually it's one of the two operas they do opening weekend.
Right. Okay. Because I remember one time I was in San Francisco Opera. I don't remember the performance, but I remember Joyce DiDonato was on the stage. And at a certain point on the projected super titles, the Giants were playing someone very important. And it was projected above the stage. Giants win 3-1. And the audience burst into applause, and Joyce DiDonato stopped and bowed in front of the audience, not understanding that they were cheering the baseball score projected above. So I don't feel that I'm forcing an issue by making this equivalency that certain people, not just the two of us, experience with opera and baseball. I find the emotions are very similar.
It's not uncommon for opera fans to also be baseball fans.
Yeah.
I remember when the Giants won their first World Series in 2010, I was at a performance of Ballo in Maschera, as a matter of fact. And at the end of the opera, for their bows, everyone came out waving Giants pennants at the opera. It was wonderful. Also, I have a very clear memory. I have a friend who is a tenor with San Francisco Opera, and other friends who are opera fans. And the four of us went to a game at Candlestick Park many years ago. Obviously, this was before 2000 because that's when the new stadium was built. And I remember us listening on the way in the car, listening to different arias sung by different singers and commenting on them as opera fans always do. And when we stopped the car and we sat there and listened to the rest of the aria that we were listening to, and the tenor said, I wonder how many cars around here had four guys in it listening to opera before going to the game. But I bet it's not that rare.
No, it's really not that rare.
Yeah.
Well, in New York, I can tell you things are similar, but a little different in that, number one, most of us don't go around in cars. But number two, that the Metropolitan Opera traditionally ends its season in May, although this coming year it will be in early June. And baseball season tends to start in April. And when the Yankees are winning, they're not this year, but when they're winning, they tend to be in the World Series, which extends well into October. And the opera season has recommenced in late September. Mm-hmm. There are many people who are fans, just fan people, who go to the Yankee game, or there's another team, they're called the New York Mets, and this year they're very good. They are the National League team. And
they have the best pitcher in baseball.
They have the best pitcher in baseball, which is kind of like having Birgit Nielsen singing Wagner for you. And that, no one better in that field. Mm-hmm. And therefore, these people are fans. And I knew many of them who would come to the Metropolitan Opera until the season ended, and then turn their fan instincts on and go to baseball games all summer. It's beautiful to be out of doors. And then in the fall, assuming that the Yankees or the Mets were not in the championship round, they would return to the opera. If the baseball team was in the championship round, then they would tend to arrive with earbuds or earlier things, little transistor radios, and listen discreetly. And it was very common when I was performance manager of the Met that I'd enter the theater and I would see an earpiece, and officially you're not allowed to listen. But given that we could not hear the sound of the ball game, I would lean over to the guest and he would, or she would occasionally go, I'm okay. And I would say, who's winning? And
understandable.
Yeah. And there are many, many opera singers who are also big baseball fans. There was the baritone Robert Merrill, who used to sing the national anthem at ball games very often for the Yankees. And there's a wonderful baritone actually near you in Colorado right now named Andrew Garland. And Andy is originally from Boston. He's now a professor of voice at the University of Colorado at Boulder. And Andy, bless his heart, is a Red Sox fan. People also need to understand that the Yankees and the Red Sox are arch rivals.
Biggest rivalry in baseball, comparable to Giants Dodgers.
It is. It is. And therefore, Andy has sung the national anthem at Fenway Park, which is a glorious old stadium in Boston, one of the last of the very old stadiums, and just magnificent for that. And so not only do we who attend these things, and in my case, work in opera, experiences, but people who are singers and performers and stagehands at the Metropolitan Opera, there's this very strong connection. And we've had New York City mayors who will shuttle between the Opera House and one of the baseball stadiums. And our current mayor, de Blasio, is from Massachusetts originally, so he's a Red Sox fan, which frankly, seriously,
how do they let that happen?
It got him off on the wrong foot. Well, so was Michael Bloomberg before that. It got de Blasio off on the wrong foot with many people in New York City because he was not rooting for one of the local teams. Well, he's over-criticized. He's criticized for the way he eats pizza. He cuts his pizza the way they do in Italy, whereas folding the slice and getting your shirt covered with grease is the way the New Yorkers do it. I cut my pizza.
I hear you.
Yeah.
I have mastered the art of folding the pizza, but it's not easy.
I can do it, but also, frankly, you have to let all the grease drain out onto the plate. I don't want the grease in my system or on my shirt. So, Harvey, before we depart from baseball and go back to music and wine, where in the United States, when you've gone to baseball games elsewhere, have you eaten very well in stadiums?
Seattle.
Really?
They have actual good sushi at the stadium there. At least they did the last time I was there, which was, I have to say, 7 or 8 years ago. I haven't found really, actually, when you and I went to a game, into a Mets Giants game at the Mets Stadium, there was some barbecue from what is it called? Something Smoke.
Blue Smoke. Michael Romano, Danny Meyer.
A pulled pork sandwich that was actually very good.
It is good.
That's maybe the best thing I've had at a New York stadium.
Yes, well, the Yankee Stadium, sadly, it's just really embarrassing how bad it is. Yeah. My best experience, Seattle was okay, but it's Baltimore.
I've never been to the stadium in Baltimore. It was the first of the modern stadiums that tried to be like old stadiums.
And it's a model. And the Baltimore Orioles are a lovely team. They don't win very often, but they have a lovely spirit about them. And so
they got crab?
And they have fantastic crab, soft shell crab, and they do the food part very well. But Baltimore is a great city musically. There's the Baltimore Symphony, which until recently was headed by Marin Alsop, who was a guest here in April. And there's the Peabody Institute of Music. It's a wonderful city. Rosa Punzel, the great singer, was from there, and James Morris, and Babe Ruth, who's the Birgit Nilsson of opera, is from Baltimore, and Billie Holiday. So it's a marvelous, underappreciated city, and they have a beautiful baseball park with a great spirit and the best food I've had anywhere. So we're gonna have to meet up in Baltimore.
One of the things I do when I was traveling, as you do, when I was traveling for business for Wine Spectator, if I could, I would schedule my visit at a time when something good was happening in the music world, whether it was a symphony concert or a solo recital or the opera or something. And something like that happens. The first time I heard Suzanne Menser sing was in Dallas when she stepped in for Cecilia Bartoli in Cenerentola, and just blew us all away. I had bought the tickets because I wanted to hear Bartoli, and I scheduled my visit to Dallas around it. But I went anyway, and was rewarded by getting introduced to a fabulous mezzo-soprano.
Well, Suzanne, if you're listening, I know her. I want you to be on this show because you are much admired. Many people, if you see the Met nightly streams on this day, there's Ariadne of Naxos with her as the composer, and it's marvelous. Um, but so let's move away from baseball and go toward music.
Okay.
Harvey, I know that
I'm going to open my wine because otherwise it's going to get too warm.
Go for it. And already I see that I have a question for you that I was going to ask. So
we can divert to that right away.
What are you drinking?
I am drinking a white Rhone wine, Côte de Rhone from Chapoutier called Beverage.
And I am drinking also French, which people don't expect from me, but I drink a lot of French wine. A Pinot Blanc from Alsace, Pierre Spar. I'm a big lover of the Grape Pinot Blanc, Pinot Bianco, which I feel is underappreciated as a grape. But we'll get into grapes in a bit.
Okay.
I know that in your university period, you were a major in music composition and conducting.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people don't know that about you. Talk about that chapter in your life.
Well, I grew up when my mother was a piano teacher and allowed me to fool around with the piano and started to teach me, I guess, when I was about 6 years old. So I had an appreciation for music. We had a lot of 78s and LPs that we played and in the house. And when we moved to Los Angeles, my mother got a
from where?
From Boston. That's where I was born. My mother managed to get on the roster of a really good classical music series at the Shrine Auditorium. We got to hear many great orchestras, many great performers for free because she was an usher, having to sit up top, but it was still, I got exposed to great music in Los Angeles. And I went to a high school where there was an excellent music program. Remember excellent music programs in high school? And as a matter of fact, when I first attended Los Angeles High School in the 10th grade, Leonard Slatkin was a senior, the conductor, and we became friends. And after he left, I was appointed student conductor of the orchestra because I had ambitions to do that. And in the meantime, I was writing music, mostly jazz, because I was really into jazz at that time. But I would write some classical oriented things as well. I took private composition lessons for composition and theory lessons for several years. My main instrument was string bass. And I was taking classes with the principal bass player of the Los Angeles Philharmonics, and he was Paul Gangursky. And I became a music major when I went to college. Started at Cal State LA, transferred to UCLA, and that was what I focused on. And several things conspired to convince me that I should probably be doing something else. One was I was good, but I wasn't that good. I understood that. And I knew that if I dedicated myself to it and starved for maybe 5 or 10 years, I could probably wind up playing in studios, maybe doing arrangements for video, for film or television, and be able to make a living at it. But I have to starve for 5 or 10 years to get there. And I was getting paid for being a journalist. I was getting paid for writing about sports in those days. And I finally said, okay, this is what I have to do. I have to use my talents where I can. And apparently the talents that people were willing to pay for were not in music. Fast forward to today, over the years, I had opportunities to write reviews on the newspapers where I worked. And people liked those reviews. And I still do it on a volunteer basis. I review the performances here in Aspen at the Aspen Music Festival. I review performances in San Francisco for Seen and Heard International, and it's a great hobby, and people seem to like what I do.
So, how did you ease into journalism? Were you doing that in college, or where did that start?
No, that comes from high school. It happened that the the journalism teacher at LA High. LA High was a great school. The journalism teacher at LA High, formerly a full staff member at the Los Angeles Times. LA High was putting out a daily student newspaper, 4 days a week. When he came, he said, "This is ridiculous. It's just a fold over paper. Let's just do a real newspaper once a week," which we did. And it was great training because he knew he would tape up the publication after it was done and scrawl corrections all over it. This could have been better if he did that. And I learned the basics of journalism. In the meantime, I was making extra money working as a copy boy at the Los Angeles Times, which I did for about 4 or 5 years while I was in college to make money, as well as playing gigs as a jazz bass player.
Did you ever get to Dodger?
Does that answer your question, or did I digress?
It does in a way, but I don't know. As you know, I think my dad was a professional musician, and I grew up in music, and I studied voice and instrument. And I don't know if I ever said to myself, "You're good, but not that good." But I too, I had been an actor as a child, and I remember the audition process and this approval, disapproval, rejection, and so on. And although I developed a very good hide for rejection, and as a journalist, often proposing things that be rejected, so I'm used to that. It's okay. But I wanted more creative control of what I did. So I decided to become more independent in my activities. And apart from working at La Scala and then the Metropolitan Opera, I've been self-employed for most of my life and have enjoyed that. It's been precarious. As you know, that can be precarious. Yeah. But on the other hand, it's also vicarious. I've never put those words together. And it enabled me to do the thing that I love most, which is travel. And the pandemic has been hard because I've not set foot off Manhattan Island since March of 2020. And I adore travel. I love the experience of travel in addition to going to places. And I have friends, and I mean real friends, all over the world. And my life is not focused on my town. My life is focused on my relationships and on places that inspire me. So that last week, my guest was Helga Rabel-Stadler, the head of the Salzburg Festival. And I've worked there a lot, but I also have a very deep love of Salzburg and beyond the festival, just as a place, in Vienna as well. And therefore, I've structured my life so that I would be in Austria a lot, and obviously Italy, which is my other home. But people tend to assume, therefore, that I'm just Italy oriented, but that's in part why I'm drinking a French wine. I love having secret places. I guess you do too, places that I don't write about, that I don't talk about, that speak to my heart. My opinion about fortune and good luck and so on is the following: that a man or a woman who is most fortunate is born in the place where they're meant to be. And if they're not born in that place, that they quickly recognize what that place is, and they get to spend a lot of time in that place. And I love New York City, but there are places that speak to me in very personal ways that are not New York City, that I go to, and that I'm transported to the next level of emotion and contentment and beauty and insight and whatever values we want to ascribe to contentment in being in the right place at the right time. And so my life has been about exploring the world. And I've done it by, number one, getting opera and music jobs around the world. But number two, by getting writing and speaking projects around the world. And it's the thing I miss most in the pandemic. I mean, obviously, I have my health and my family has health, and that's the most important thing. But second to that, I've had to journey in my own mind to places that used to be completely part of my life. And
we've all had to do that.
Yeah, have you?
But you have more to miss that a lot of people do.
I have a lot to miss. And, you know, FaceTime and Zoom are fine, but it's the acoustics, it's the smells, it's the sensorial aspects of certain places. There's a place, I never talk about it by name, but there's a place that's my refuge in Italy that I go to. And I miss it terribly because I miss the sound of the place, and I miss the particular visuals and the rhythm. And it's a town that doesn't have any cars, and therefore it's accessible only by foot or bicycle or the train that comes through periodically. And there's an ambulance, I will say that, to take us out of there if we have to go. But the ambulance is parked in a strategic spot. But apart from that, there really are not vehicles. And when you don't have vehicular traffic, everything sounds different. I don't live in Venice. People may think I'm talking about Venice, but it's not Venice at all. I'm in a very little town. But the relationship that a person has, I'll say his, but it could be her or theirs, to a place is very intimate. You're right now in Aspen, a place I've never been to. And
you'd be welcome to visit us.
Thank you. It is, I wasn't fishing for an invite, but it's among the probably 50 or 60 places that I've not been to that are on my list, that I do have an actual list. Talk about Aspen as a place, and also the music festival, because it is very famous.
The music festival is part of what drew us to Aspen in the first place. My wife had a very, very good, well, we had a very good friend that my wife had met. She was assistant to this professor at Miami-Dade College when we were in Florida. And we've kept in touch with her and her husband. They're both passed away now. But in 1992, I remember we had a conversation visiting them, and they said, you got to come to Aspen with us. We go and spend a few weeks every summer in Aspen to get away from the heat. But also, it's a great town. There's a music festival. It's great. I knew about the music festival, but it's a great town, high standards about a lot of things. And we said, okay, fine. So we rented a place, stayed together, actually with a mutual friend of ours, Filippo Di Bellardino. And for 2 or 3 years, we did that. And then we realized that we wanted to stay longer than we can get all of us together. So we started renting our own place. And in 2000, and we loved the music festival. And around 2000, we decided we're going to have to either buy an apartment or figure something out. And we wound up with what we have, which is a fractional ownership for 6 weeks in the heart of Aspen. The festival itself in the early 2000s was good, but there were much better festivals. There was much more exciting stuff going on. But there were glimmers of things. I remember George Shirley was on the wonderful tenor baritone. And to see him do a master class was an experience I think everyone should see, because he was able to express what a singer needs to do to make things happen. And I learned a lot about music from people like George Shirley, people like a cellist named Yehuda Hanani, that were open to exposing what they know, not just to their students, but to people attending the festival. It disappointed us when we went to other music festivals and there weren't these opportunities. It's one of the things we love about Aspen. You run into the musicians in line at the grocery store or walking on the street, and you can stop and have a little chat, and it's very relaxed and absolutely wonderful. And that's part of the reason we could keep coming back. But over the years, the quality kept going up, partly because the students that they were attracting, and the students make up most of it, basically everything except the principals in the several orchestras that they have here. The opera program, which until last year was run by Edward Berkeley from Juilliard, he has now moved on, but Renee Fleming and
Yes.
Patrick Summers are running the festival now. And this is the first year we'll be able to see what they do. I attended a master class last Saturday that Renee and Patrick did. The quality of the singers across the board absolutely blew us away. And what they were able to give to the singers in terms of what they can do to fine tune what they were doing even better was fantastic. Those classes that Edward did over the years showed us from the outside what goes in to a singer's ability to give us what they give us.
I also believe that these classes serve to build audiences and followings. Because, for example,
absolutely.
if I hear a young singer who I'm particularly impressed with, I'll make sure to follow what she's doing as she moves through her career. And
Brian Mulligan was one of the singers here who we looked at each other and said, "Who's that?"
Yep.
He's going to do something. Golda Schultz is another one.
I didn't know she was there. The South African.
She was here for 2 years.
Wonderful. Yeah.
She sang Alice in a really good Falstaff.
Really?
Yeah.
It's part of what we were saying before, that if we have a music job or a food and wine job, we tend to check, is there a baseball game? Is there an opera? To make a visit to a city a little more meaningful and consequential. And have you ever been to the Vervier Festival in Switzerland?
I have not. I have close friends who are involved with the Vervier Festival, but it happens at the same time as this, and it would be very difficult to. Yeah,
that is exactly my point. Vervier was modeled after Aspen in a way. And in that it has a very strong educational component. It has a youth orchestra. It has conductors and singers who come in and teach, and have people like me who come teach. And in 2012, I was the scholar in residence, and we had people like Ileana Kotrubash and Thomas Allen and Thomas Kwastoff and Anushka Shankar and Alfred Brendel and people of that level. And
it's a high level.
Right.
It's a high level group. Yeah.
And the thing was that we teachers would have our students in our projects, but then we would always make a point of going to the classes given by the other people.
And performances.
And in addition, I would have my nightly lecture at 6 p.m. I did 14 lectures each night of the festival at 6 p.m. that most of the audience and the attending public came to. And you're high up in an Alp, you run into people in the dairy shop. It's called La Chaumière, where they have beautiful Swiss milk and cheeses and beautiful apricot preserve and so on, because that valley has the best apricots in Switzerland. And it is very intimate. And there would be Alfred Brendel asking about, how old the cheese is and will it go with this fruit? And you see them as people and you meet them as people. And while, yes, especially I will name Alfred Brendel, I'm in awe of Alfred Brendel.
I can understand why.
I did manage to speak to him. And people like Thomas Allen and Ileana Kotrubash are people I've worked with and know, so the relationship is different. But Alfred Brendel in the cheese shop, or Alfred Brendel buying me a coffee and asking about my feelings about Mozart, you can't replace that. And I, in part, as a professional there, would also be getting this great education. So part of why I've never been to Aspen is because my work has taken me to Vervier, to Salzburg, to Munich, which is also July, to festivals in Italy, especially Verona, but also Macerata and Martina Franca. And same with Santa Fe. I was in Santa Fe in 89 and 93, and I've never been back since. And it's one of the great festivals. And we get on our paths, we get on our routes.
Yeah.
And
well, it's hard for us not to come back to Aspen, because it's a reward to us after a year of not being here. I mean, San Francisco is not a bad place to be from. New York's not a bad place to be from. But the change of pace and the fact that we have a whole different group of friends here, some of whom are many of whom are musicians. is what draws us back as strongly as the music. And speaking of Santa Fe, I'm taking 4 days off to go to Santa Fe to see the new opera Lord of the Cries by I'm blanking on the composer's name. Not Corigliano, is it? No. It'll come to me.
Mark Adamo was the librettist, and I'm forgetting who. I know what you mean. Yeah.
But it looks exciting, and and it's worth. We like to go to Santa Fe. We usually disappear there for 2 or 3 days while we're here because it's a full day's drive, really.
Let's talk about wine, and then we're going to get back to music.
Okay.
And most people, when they see or hear the name Harvey Steiman, immediately associate you with wine. And how did you acquire the knowledge? You're like a London taxi driver who you can ask anything in London and they'll know, which lane and which SW7 and so forth. And you're like that, but not in a geeky way. Because there are people who are wine geeks who can, talk about acidity, that this is 12.8 or whatever they say. And it's like baseball statistics. And I get a little bored with baseball statistics. I'm more interested in the poetry of baseball and the beauty of baseball. And similarly with wine, I'm not a competitive guy and I like to learn. And there are people who, look at, well, let's take the Wine Spectator, which gives numerical evaluations to wines. And people say, well, this one got a 92 and that one got a 91. So I'm going to take the 92. And I look for terminology. I look for adjectives. I look for words when I think about wine. And how did you get into it? And how did you develop your style and your approach, which is almost universally admired?
Well, thank you.
Almost.
There's a lot to unpack there. There's a lot to unpack there. Let's go. The history first. In 1973, I was on the sports staff of the Miami Herald, and I heard that the music critic was going to retire. So I went to the managing editor, said, by the way, my academic background's in music, and I had already written a few reviews and on the side, and I'd like to apply for the job. And he said, I wish you'd come in last week. I just hired Jim Roos. I don't know if you knew Jim. He was a music critic at the Miami Herald for 25 years, and he unfortunately died of a brain cancer, but lovely guy. We got to be great friends. But the managing editor said to me, I noticed you've been doing some reviews of restaurants and they look like they're pretty good. Can you cook? And I lied and I said, yeah. I mean, I like to cook, but I really didn't know much about it. And he said, well, the food editor is retiring. Would you like to give that a try? And we'll hold your job open in sports for 3 months. If you like what you're doing and we like what you're doing, you just keep doing it. And that was in 1973. And I really didn't know that much about cooking, but I read a lot and I interviewed everybody I could. Every time I interviewed a good cook, whether it was an amateur or a professional, I learned something, and it stuck up here. And I'd go home and try doing it myself. And I learned techniques. I'm very much a technique-oriented cook, not a recipe follower, although I know how to write a recipe and I know how to interpret a recipe. And by 1977, a friend of mine, another food editor who I had made friends with, who was the food editor of the San Francisco Examiner, called me and said, I'm leaving. If you're interested, you should contact this person. And they hired me. And one of the codicils, one of the requirements, I said, I have to be able to write the wine column. Actually, there was somebody very good named Bob Thompson writing the wine column, and we would alternate. I'd write half the wine column, he'd write the other half. And I learned a lot from talking to winemakers, from talking to other wine writers. In Miami, I was fortunate to fall in with a group of a tasting group, which included some fairly wealthy physicians and the wine buyer for the best wine shop in town. And we'd all bring a bottle of wine and we talk about the wines. And I learned a lot about that. I learned a lot from Barney and Bell Rhodes when I moved to San Francisco. Great wine collectors over the years, but I also learned from sommeliers and other wine writers. And what I really just, to distill what you were talking about, one of the things I learned as a sports writer was not to get too technical when you're writing about sports. And I tried to do the same thing with wine. I know all the technical stuff. I can understand what's going on, but I don't have to bore the reader with it. I can understand why things are a certain way and maybe make some balancing comments about things along the way. But it is really about how the wine affects our taste, how our taste affects what we like in the wine, and how it fits in the circumstances, whether it's at a meal or by itself, and what kind of meal it is and how it all fits together. I'm more interested in that than all the technical stuff. And then I got hired by the Wine Spectator. Actually, I'd been with the Examiner for 7 years, and Marvin Shanken, who was the publisher and editor of Wine Spectator, called me, and while I was there, they invited me to be part of their tasting group. So I knew all the people on the staff. There were some other outside people that were tasting at that time. He came to a parting of the ways with the executive editor at the time and said, "I want you to come and work for me." And I said, "I'm really happy where I am. Let me recommend so-and-so." And this went on for most of the year. He took me out to several very, very nice dinners and convinced me that he really wanted me, not somebody else. And I took a leave of absence from the Examiner and never went back. And I was with Wine Spectator for 36 years.
I don't know if you know that Harold Schoenberg, who was a very famous music critic for the New York Times for a very long time, do you know what his beat was, what he covered before he went into music journalism?
I do not.
Boxing. He was the boxing pugilism writer for the New York Times.
There are a lot of food and wine writers who started out in sports.
Yeah.
My very good, unfortunately departed friend, Bill Rice, was a sports writer before he became a food and wine writer. And there's a long list of them.
I mention this because I get prickly when people become very snooty and puff their chests out when they talk about wine in a very competitive way. And you don't do that, which is part of why I admire you and enjoy you as a friend and as company. But you were talking about these men in Florida, these physicians who had their wine groups and they would open up a lot of wines. One of my many income streams has been to be a guest speaker and leader at wine events like this that often involve usually men. I wish more women did it, but somehow it seems to be men. In Palm Beach County, I know some men who are more in the legal trade, and I know a few medical people. But all around the country, I get invited to, before the pandemic, to speak and guide a wine tasting on a topic, or just discuss the wine with them. And they tend to break down into two: those who are very caring and interested in the wine and the culture, and those who want to show that they can afford a very famous wine. And I've been at wine tastings or in restaurants where someone will buy a $10,000 bottle of wine. I don't think any wine is worth $10,000. And he would have a glass of it and then very ostentatiously say, "Well, this is all I want." And then, we mortals would get to sample a little bit of the wine after. I would love to see wine be more democratic, not so hierarchical.
I think the next generations are doing that.
Good. Talk about
I've been excited about millennials. So they get a bad rap. And then the generations that followed them are even more democratic. Now they have their own shibboleths about wine, whether it's natural wine or some other things that may not really matter as much as they think they do. But at least they care. and they care about the wine, not about how much it cost, not about what score it got, but what can it offer them in the way of an experience.
I can tell you that in my teaching of wine, but also my experience of wine, I tend about 98% of the time to imagine the wine with the food and not to imagine the wine on its own. I know so many people who will talk about a characteristic of a wine without entering the food aspect, and that's because many of them don't cook or don't know the details of cuisine and flavor and taste. And you and I, I'm sure if we spoke about it, would discover that we know many winemakers who, when they're showing us a big, beautiful Barolo or Burgundy or Cabernet Sauvignon, whatever the big red is, and you ask, well, what will this go with? Meat.
Actually, I love the this is a phrase I learned in Piemonte. They refer to wines like that as vini di meditazione.
Yes.
Wines to meditate on. Not just, you can drink it with food if you want to, but they want to be able to just be them and the wine and meditate on it. And I understand that. Those are great things to do with wine, but I also want to drink it with dinner.
Yeah. Well, you know that I wrote a book years ago called La Terra Fortunata, the splendid food and wine of Friuli, Venezia, Giulia. And that's a region, for listeners, the northeasternmost in Italy. It borders Slovenia, the former Yugoslavia. It borders Austria. A lot of it was under the Habsburg domain until 1918. Another part of it was part of the Venetian Empire, the Veneto. And it's the region of Italy that uses the most spices in its cuisine. It's not necessarily spicy, but you would find things like nutmeg in the food that you would not necessarily find elsewhere, or cinnamon or clove or all those spices. They do use herbs as well, but they're most known for their spices. And they have a remarkable range of grape varieties that are autochthonous, that are native to the area. And I've never anywhere in the world experienced a more sophisticated talent among the people for pairing the flavors of grape wine grapes and of certain foods. I don't go by this thing of meat or fish, red or white, but I tend to ask, how is the food being prepared and what's it being flavored with that would invite me to bring in a particular wine.
Weight and flavors. Those are the two things. The weight of the wine and the weight of the food and the flavor. Do the flavors go together? That's what makes a wine match.
So, for example, in Friuli, Venezia, Giulia, they tend to pair Cabernet Franc with nutmeg a little bit. Yeah.
Sure, I can see that.
And
I can see Pinot Bianco with nutmeg also.
I see Pinot Bianco with everything. That's my prejudice.
Okay.
But they tend to pair Ribolla, which is a wonderful local grape, one of my favorites. It's a white, with scallop. Seems to be a beautiful combination.
I can see that, because there's a richness, there's a fattiness to the wine that would be, the texture would be good.
Exactly. So take Friuli or take anywhere in the world, take the wine you're drinking right now and pick it up and show us how to savor and explore a wine, and then talk about what you're experiencing and what food or what flavorings you'd pair with it.
Okay. Well, this is a wine from Côte du Rhône, which is a very large area in the south of France. And the three grapes involved in this are Grenache Blanc, Clairette, which is unique to that area, and Bourbon Blanc, which is one of the 13 or 15 varieties that are permitted. It's actually more prevalent in Languedoc than it is in the Rhone. But what you wind up with is a wine with a little more body than you expect from a white wine, but it's all fruit, and there's a little bit of that spiciness that you were talking about. And that's what I tasted when I tasted this wine before. The fruit character is more like pear to me, like a ripe pear. And then there's this spicy finish and a little astringency that's like the skin of the pear. So I'm thinking about, okay, what's good with pears? What's good with those flavors? And my mind immediately goes to, well, it could be fish, could be a fish or seafood. I can drink this, I can think, with crab or with shrimp, and use a little maybe nutmeg or an interesting pepper in the sauce, or just the seasoning of the cooking liquid. But I can also see this with veal or pork. Especially, I think veal or pork cooked on the grill with a little bit, maybe a squeeze of lemon, because a little bit of citrus character here, that would tie it together. I probably enjoy that too.
I tell you what I'd pair that with. Many years ago, I was working in London at the Royal Opera and went one day to the Royal Academy of Art on the Piccadilly, and they have a very nice little cafeteria there. And they had a special sandwich that day that I've never seen there before since, and I've never seen it anywhere else except that I make it at home. They took a bread made of corn flour. This was not corn bread the way the Americans think of it, but it was actual crunchy bread that had sultanas, white raisins or yellow raisins in it.
Okay.
And they sliced pear transparently thin. It was like paper. And they crumbled Stilton cheese. And they put these slivers of pear and Stilton cheese between the slices of this cornbread with sultanas. And they made a grilled cheese sandwich on the griddle. And so the pear and the Stilton and the corn and the sultanas merged. And that's what I would have with your wine.
You invited me over?
Yeah, sure. I just have to find
good.
that bread, which is not easy to find. I can get the pears and the Stilton and the grill and so on, but not everything else.
Stilton is one of the few blue cheeses that I can, for some reason, over the years, I've lost my taste for blue cheese. I think I just don't like mold very much. So, but Stilton for me has enough else going for it that it's something I like to eat. When I make grilled cheese sandwiches, I sometimes do the same thin slicing thing with apples and put apples in the middle too. And that adds a nice.
And what kind of cheese? And what kind
of cheese? There's a Toma is a good one that I like in grilled cheese. But I usually will mix the cheeses, maybe Toma and some dry jack for a little extra zing.
And then what kind of bread?
Oh, a good country bread, whatever I have. I know there's a lot of good sourdough or European style country breads available to me in San Francisco. So I would use one of those. And lately, since I've been trapped at home, we've been doing an awful lot of baking, and I actually found a pretty good recipe. I got a pretty good recipe from a video that Jacques Pepin did on making baguettes at home, and they came out really good. I'd never been successful making baguettes at home before, but these came out good.
The reason I'm asking you about your grilled cheese sandwich, and I want listeners to understand my motivation, is there's a difference between being geeky and analytical and developing a sense of pairing and flavor and what the Italians call abbinamento, which means the way things go together. And it's this thought process that one can apply to wine and food, but also to making an opera production in terms of the colors, the lighting, the costuming, the makeup that would go with particular music in a production.
And the casting.
And the casting,
the right,
of course.
The right voice for the right voice and the right personality for the right role.
But when you said thinly sliced apple for your grilled cheese sandwich, I could have brought up any number of cheddars, whether it's traditional English or I'm a big fan of Irish cheddar, Australian, Vermont, they're American cheddars. There are cheddars everywhere, and some are very tangy and sharp and some are mild. And then again, it would be the bread and how you make it. And then do you cook it in butter, or do you use a press? Because that changes the flavor and the texture. And then would lead me to ask what wine you would pair with that particular sandwich you just described. I would pick Grenache.
Usually I don't have wine with a grilled cheese sandwich, so I have to think about it.
From now on.
That's usually lunch, and we don't usually have wine at lunch. Although, yes, certainly I can see Grenache. I can see, I like white wines with cheese in general. I think red sometimes becomes a problem. But with the cheeses, certainly with the cheese I'm talking about, you could drink either. With cheddar, I think I'd go with white or something sweet. So maybe a Riesling.
Mm-hmm. So here we go again with something that I think I know a lot of people don't understand, because I'm asked this all the time. A grape, let's say Riesling, or I'd rather say Sauvignon Blanc, when planted in different soils and raised in different climates, and with Sauvignon Blanc, because there's such diversity, then there's the input of the woman or man who's tending the grapes and making the wine.
Mm-hmm.
It's a process, it's a series of decisions all the way along that results in a wine that's different from another. Similarly, that you can pick up a score of Le Nozze di Figaro, and the notes are the same and the words are the same, but then everything that starts with the score, which is the Sauvignon Blanc or Le Nozze di Figaro, and ends up on opening night or opening the bottle. Talk about it in a wine sense, but equate it to music if you wish.
Actually, in reviewing wines over the years or writing about wines over the years, I have often turned to music for a simile or a metaphor that'll work in conveying what it is about that wine that makes it what it is. And yeah, from a technical standpoint, where it is grown is the fundamental. That's and you're right. Sauvignon Blanc grown in the Marlborough region of New Zealand has a very different personality than Sauvignon Blanc grown in the Loire Valley. Yeah. And even within the Loire Valley, the difference between Sancerre and Quincy is very different. And similarly on the West Coast, whether it's in Napa Valley or Sonoma or the South Coast, Santa Barbara, is going to be different. Whether it's coastal or inland, the grape is just going to express something different. And then it's the winemaker's, it's the grower's job to try to get that grape to be all that it can be. And then it's the winemaker's job to take that grape and turn it into wine that has something to say, or it's just a wine that you're going to slosh down dinner with. It could come out either way. There's no guarantees, but once you figure out how you're going to get the best out of that as a winemaker, you tend to stick to that and then tweak the details. I don't know if that answers your question yet. There's probably more steps I can talk to. Do you put the wine in barrel to get that barrel character?
Well, first talk about the step of when to pick the grape.
Okay. Grapes go through a ripening process, like any fruit, go through a ripening process. If you've ever tasted an unripe peach, you know what happens if you didn't wait long enough. And it's the same with grapes. It's going to taste like acid. It's not going to have that full flavor that the fruit can provide. So if you wait too long, it's going to get sloppy. It's going to get slushy. It's not going to have but at the peak, it's going to taste like that peach you really want. And for some people, that peak is a little bit early. You want a peach to be a little bit crunchy. I do not. I want it to be soft, but I don't want it to be mushy. That's a window that maybe is 2 hours long sometimes.
Yeah.
But that's what I'm looking for. It's the same with the grape. Some grapes give you, and some grapes and some vintages give you the chance to wait several days, even a week before you pick. And during that time, the grape is not just in stasis, it's developing more sugar and it's losing acidity. And that's what happens with the peach too. That sharpness that a peach has before it gets ripe goes away. And if you wait too long, it just becomes mushy. But at some point, the acid, the sugar, the flavors all come into balance. And you're looking for that in the grape too. That's what a winemaker is looking for. Some will err on the side of the acid because they want that crispness in the finished wine. And some will err on the side of ripeness because they want all those ripe flavors. That's a choice. It's nothing right or wrong about that, as long as it doesn't go too far.
I would say the equivalent in opera is that the picking of the grape is what we call freezing the show. In other words, the production, the rehearsals, the musical values that have been rehearsed and developed, this is where we stop. And then you have the vinification, the making of it, the performance, the next phase. And you and I know, but many people don't know, that when grapes are then macerated, when they're turned to wine, in effect, what's happening is that the sugars, the natural sugars, not added, but the natural sugars in the grapes transform into alcohol in the vinification process. But then there are choices along the way that the winemaker does about the alcohol, the sugars, the flavors. Talk about what happens there.
Well, there's a lot of technical stuff there, but you can manipulate the wine in various ways. And some of the great wines of the world are manipulated. Just leaving it alone, like natural wines, you're counting on Mother Nature to do your work for you. And that when that works, it's lovely. When it doesn't work, it's awful. So you have to you have to know where to intervene and when to leave it alone. I remember Neil Empson. You probably know Neil.
Importer.
He was a very important exporter-importer of Italian wines and wines from other parts of the world. A native New Zealander, actually, lived in Milan. And I remember him describing one winemaker in Chianti. He said he knows just when to touch the wine and when to leave it alone. And I think someone who is producing an opera, everybody involved in producing an opera, understands let's not mess around with this. It's good the way it is, or we really have to develop something more here. And that's the magic. That's what distinguishes a maestro from somebody who's just getting the work done.
It's the same with writing an article or a book, and it's the same with doing a painting.
Sure.
And I've known artists who have done a wonderful painting, but then they feel they have to fix it and they ruin it. And I've seen editors come into a book that's a good book and wreck it, and articles too, and so on. And it's because we're dealing with our feelings here too, that sometimes we do need improvement, but sometimes
with opera, very much the feelings.
Yes. But in other cases, we need to tell the person who wants to correct us that it's actually good and I'm pleased with it. And if
that's
you
a tough conversation.
It is. You have to have that conversation.
You have to have a relationship with the editor as a writer to do that.
It is a very tough conversation. But similarly, between a diva and a conductor, that she may say, I sound better this way. And he may say, or she may say, the conductor may say, but that's not the way it's written. And the diva will say, it may not be the way it's written, but it's the way I sound good. And I have my breath sustains this way, or the colors in my voice are more attractive that way. And usually what happens in performance, which is different from printing a book or bottling a wine, is that she will do whatever she wants to do. And that's something a diva can do that we as writers and winemakers, whatever, or chefs cannot do.
It's just not just in opera. I have to tell this story. As a footnote. I was in New York once, and I went to a performance of Beethoven's Violin Concerto with Anne-Sophie Mutter and the French Canadian conductor's name is escaping me at the moment.
Not Charles Dutoit.
Charles Dutoit.
Okay.
And Dutoit started things off at a certain pace, and she decided they wanted to go a little faster. And then when he brought the orchestra back in, he slowed it down again. And this war went on for the entire first movement. And I sat there utterly fascinated. How are they going to resolve this? They never did.
Mm.
And of course, I don't know what the people in the audience thought was going on. I had no idea. But obviously, they had a difference of opinion, and it played out right in front of us. And I've seen things like that happen on the opera stage as well.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. Well, I've known many of the world's finest singers who have a policy, and I agree with them. If the conductor plays too loud, they will not shout. They would rather be perceived as being drowned out by a thoughtless conductor than wreck their own voices, which is I agree with that.
Mhm.
And really some of the biggest stars who have plenty of voice, but they will not allow themselves to be drowned out. And I respect that.
I
But
do too.
an audience member doesn't necessarily like it or get it. And often I've heard people say, she's not loud enough, she doesn't have any voice. And I want to reply, well, it's really the conductor who is not paying attention and creating a balance here.
Most of my friends would blame the conductor.
Yeah.
In an instance like that.
Right. Most of my friends are singers,
so
they would blame the conductor.
When in doubt.
So you said a word, and I want to talk about that word, namely balance. I'm a believer, as an American, that our society, which is full of wonderful things, and I'm proud to be an American, but we have an issue with overdoing it, certain things. And there's the expression, go big or go home, which I don't always subscribe to. Namely, that portions have to be the biggest. Music has to be the loudest. Cars have to be the fastest. Everybody has to be the smartest, or everybody has to be the richest. And when we make the excess the value, rather than equilibrium, balance, or in music and wine, we would say harmony, these are very different sensations. And I often find myself more at home talking to Europeans about certain things because they seem to understand that balance better. And when they go off it, like starting a war, that's excessive and that's not good. But there's something, and I'm generalizing here, about our country, which I love, that I just wish I could teach Americans, that sometimes less is better, that quieter is more meaningful, that a glass of a $25 wine that is savored and beautifully made is as good as your $10,000 wine. And where do you stand on the notions of balance, and how people in all their sensorial perceptions, not just wine or music, evaluate?
I don't think Americans are unique in wanting that level of exuberance or excess. I think you find that in a lot of cultures. But you're right, it is something that's very American. The size of our opera houses is one thing that comes to mind. And I remember the first time I went to La Scala and sat in that space and listened to not a great cast, but a very good cast. And I really understood what it means, what the composers were writing for. They were writing for those kinds of spaces. Metropolitan Opera, San Francisco Opera, with almost 3,000, 2,800 seats.
The Met is 3,786.
I know. Is that the biggest opera house in the country? I think it is.
Yes, but Chicago and San Francisco are over 3,000.
Really? Okay. Chicago is an interesting place because it's narrow and long.
Yeah.
It's an unusual place to listen to opera. And I've heard some great operas in Chicago.
Yeah.
But I think the big opera house does tend to demand voices that can do it. A voice that can be comfortable at La Scala may not be comfortable at San Francisco or the Met. On the other hand, the acoustics are very good in those places. And if they sing the way they can with a good conductor, everything comes out with the balance you want. No, nobody's too loud, nobody's too soft, and the whole thing fits together. Now, when you come to a big crescendo, the big climax of a crescendo, you want to be able to have some oomph to that. You don't want to hold back too much on it, but there's a way to to figure out how to do that in performance. And I love it when that happens. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes the climax gets to be so big you can't hear anything but the orchestra.
Well, I will say about the Met, and it's not because I'm a New Yorker and it's not because I used to work at the Met, but the Metropolitan Opera House has exquisite acoustics. And
Yeah.
there are a few dead areas under the overhang at the rear of the orchestra, the stalls, basically from row Z to EE is a dead zone. But apart from that, the Met
there's
really
an odd spot in the orchestra, right and left, about a quarter of the way back, that almost echoes. There's a reverberation that drove me nuts, and I know not to sit there anymore.
That's around row G or H.
Yeah, right around there, F, G, H,
on the
around
sides,
there.
yeah. But for the most part, it's pretty magnificent. And
yes,
on my subscription, I have one subscription in the grand tier and another in the balcony. And the grand tier, I tend to pick shows where I want to see the theater more, and the stage picture is beautiful and the acoustics are great. The balcony, if it's an opera I've heard many times and I want pure sound, I will sit up in the balcony, and it's really wonderful.
Same in San Francisco. The back of the balcony is the place where all the sound comes together.
Yeah. So the Met, despite its size, they did a really good job. I've been in many theaters where the acoustics are wretched in the US and elsewhere. Mm-hmm. Needless to say, because many people don't know this, we don't use microphones and amplification. In theaters that do, I don't take
except for certain operas that require it. Certain modern operas,
like Salome, where John the Baptist is singing from the crypt. Yeah. But basically, unless it's called for, we don't do that. And when people see microphones attached to singers, either in the wig or behind the neck, it's usually because they're doing a radio broadcast. But I'm asked all the time, no, they're not being amplified, at least at the Met. I know that for certain.
Also in San Francisco.
Also in San Francisco. You know, I had Matthew Schilvach on the show a few months ago, and he's the head of the San Francisco Opera. And I was very admiring of the fact, I know him, so full disclosure, that your company had a kind of season this year in a way that not everyone did, and certainly as a digital presence. The Met has streamed every night, but San Francisco did festivals, and I was part of the Ring Festival in March. And it's a very hard thing to maintain an audience. I'm going to make a generalization, Harvey, and you can agree or disagree. I think you'll agree that New York and San Francisco are two of the most liberal, progressive, open cities in the country. But I do believe that they have more conservative opera audiences than do places like Houston and Chicago to some degree, and St. Louis. And there are places that we don't necessarily think of as being very liberal, left wing, whatever you want to call it. And I think that it's because our companies in New York and San Francisco are the first and the third oldest in America. The Met 1883, Cincinnati 1920, San Francisco 1923. And maybe it's the older entrenched audience that has formed a value system all through the decades that newer companies, for Dallas, for example, we think of Dallas as not the most liberal city in the country, but I've seen experimental things in Dallas that would be booed off the stage in New York and have been well accepted in Dallas. What do you think about this juxtaposition of political openness, but cultural closed-mindedness?
Yeah, I never thought of it in those terms before. I know in San Francisco, I've watched things happen in I've lived in San Francisco since 1977, and we've been subscribers to the opera and the symphony since the early 80s when I had enough money to do it. And I remember it from the symphony point of view, San Francisco, even though we had conductors like Seiji Ozawa, the audience tended to resist anything new. Ada de Wart was the conductor in the 1990s, early 1990s, and made a point of having what he called the wet ink series, which was new works.
Mm-hmm.
John Adams was a big contributor to that. And in fact, he basically ran it. And the works we were hearing were works that audiences could relate to immediately. And that made a big difference. And I think the same kind of thing, and then of course, Michael Tilson Thomas came along. And, you know, my wife likes to say she hated dissonance until Michael Tilson Thomas started playing stuff and showing her what a little heart does for making that music relatable. And now she loves it. She loves it. He made a believer out of her and a lot of us and a lot of audience. And I remember him doing an entire program of George Antheil, which is not something you would expect a major symphony orchestra to do. And the audience was full. And I think the same thing has been happening in opera as well. This year, San Francisco Opera is bringing back one of its commissions, Bright Shang's opera, The Dream of the Red Chamber, which I loved when they did it. It's a spectacle. The music is wonderful, and it's an all Asian cast, mostly Chinese, and it's wonderful stuff. And I don't know if you got to see it or not, but I'm so happy that it's coming back. It's coming back in June next year. But it's the only new opera on a very abbreviated. There's only 5 operas this year because it's a transition year. But there have been, I remember one of the hardest tickets the San Francisco Opera ever had was for Messiaen's opera, Saint-François d'Assise. They did 7 performances. They probably could have done 7 more and sold them out. And this is a tough opera to listen to, but it was glorious. And the audiences loved it. I think when the passion is there and when the communication is there, people will come.
And if you have the right artistic director or general manager or other speaker who communicates it. So, for example, Michael Tilson Thomas, who was with the San Francisco Symphony, I believe, for 25 years or 20 years, a long time.
That's correct. He's now the emeritus or the
right, and he's just leaving. But when you,
by the way, the guy who replaces him is no slouch.
That's Rebecca Solomon.
Yeah,
that's pretty terrific. But what I mean is, his initials, Michael Tilson Thomas, MTT. You would see banners all over San Francisco that simply said MTT, and most San Franciscans, even if they were not symphony goers, knew who that was.
Yeah.
And like Michael Jordan in Chicago for the Bulls, even if you didn't go to basketball games, you knew who Michael Jordan was. And it was a similar thing there. And that was in part his personality, but it was in part also clever promotion by the symphony.
Well, Michael is not shy about promotion.
No, he's not.
And I think, you know, there are a lot of musicians who are very serious and aren't comfortable with that. And I understand that. I won't name her by name, but there was a lovely soprano that we got to know personally, and she never was much for putting herself out there for publicity, and her career dried up.
Well, I'll name my lovely soprano who I knew and loved and got to work with, Shirley Verrett, was not interested at all in publicity and didn't do that. And her career didn't dry up because she was Shirley Verrett. But nonetheless, she had the luxury of not having to do that. But I think that take other comparable people, Grace Bunbury, Beverly Sills, Joan Sutherland, did some degree of public conversation and presence. Another artist who mostly is very private is Kiri Takanawa, and would do a little bit of it, but really not too much. But when you're at that level of those artists, you can make that choice. But I think, too, it's now more incumbent on artists to be out there among the audience and
it's a social media world.
Not your rarefied, distant presence like you think of Milano.
It's hard to avoid that.
Yeah. But I think some do. Christine Gerke, to me, is the model of someone who does incredibly well the presence, but at the same time maintaining the artistic distance so that she can be on the stage, Electra, Brunhilde, Leonora, all the things that she does so well, but at the same time have an accessibility and a likableness that is native to her. But she knows how to be a model and a leader without compromising her interior life and core that makes her performances so great. That's my view.
Yeah, that's a tough balance for any artist to make.
It is, definitely. So you provided a wonderful list, as I asked my guests to do, of Adagio selections. And I would say that some of them are kind of mainstream, a couple of them not so mainstream. For example, your La Traviata, you have a singer, Fritz Wunderlich, who was not necessarily the most Italianate singer by breeding, but by performance, I think you found him more so.
Yeah, I mean, my wife and I both have a strong connection with him, even though we never saw him or heard him live, only on recordings. And most of the recordings we heard first just demonstrated the voice because they were all in German. Italian operas, in many cases, or Italian arias. But there was something about the fluidity, the naturalness of that voice that utterly won us over. And then someone played a bootleg copy of what is now available on CD of this performance. I believe it was also Teresa Stratus's debut in that role. And this was it? I forget where it was, Vienna?
Yeah.
I think it was Vienna. And
Bavaria. Munich.
Yeah, Munich. And listening to him sing in Italian, we looked at each other and said, that could be an Italian singing. He got all of the nuances. And of course, it's a terrific performance. And that's why I included it, because I think it's a landmark.
So take his voice and apply terms that are wine oriented, but also used in music. I would say notes is one of those particular things. You talk about notes in a wine, talk about notes in a voice, and in the music, of course.
Notes in a wine are flavor or aromatic elements that you call that a spicy note or a lemony note or something like that. Notes in music is an entirely different thing. It's the pitch, the pitch and the duration that the score calls for. But I think in listening to his voice, there's a like they use the word fluidity, and you want to use that in wine doesn't make sense, but it's that sense of silkiness, that texture that just flows, and nothing is stopping it. It's free. And I know a lot of singers, huh?
There's no sediment. You don't have to decant.
There's no tannin there. It's just the pure sound of his voice, and the way he uses it, the way he directs the voice, has a point in intensity and balance. It never goes too far. It never recedes too far back. It's in every recording I've ever heard of it, it's just exactly what I want to hear. And in wine, it would be, okay, there's all these flavors, but they all point in the same direction.
Yeah, that's a very good way to say it. Another one that you picked that is by now mainstream, it was not always, is the Mahler Third Symphony with the San Francisco Symphony, Michael Tilson Thomas, and Michelle DeYoung, who will be a guest on this program pretty soon, mezzo-soprano. Is it the Mahler? Is it the San Francisco Symphony? Is it MTT? What is it about this performance particularly that you selected it among many you could have chosen?
We discovered that the relationship between this conductor and that orchestra is magic for Mahler. And the interesting thing is that no two performances are identical. One of the great things about Michael Tilson Thomas as a conductor was that he brought the orchestra up to the technical level that he wanted, but he gave them the freedom to put their own artistry into what they were doing. Everything that had to be played together was played together, but when there is a soloist or a section, they get to go off a little bit on their own. He's not conducting the individual. He's letting them take the ball and run with it. And in this particular, and the Mahler 3 is, it's not my favorite Mahler symphony. I don't know that I have one, but it's one of them. And it's not, I mean, it's a long piece, but it goes in many different directions, but eventually it all coalesces. And you know exactly why he was doing things at different, why the composer was doing things at different times to bring it together. And then when he brings in the voice, it's for Ehrlich, it's just, it's magic.
Mahler, there's a dispute about how many symphonies he wrote. It's generally accepted he wrote 9. He began the 10th. There's a guy named Derek Cook who's a specialist on the 10th, but he wrote a work called Das Lied von der Erde. Yes. That is a symphony in all effects, but it's not called a symphony because allegedly he was superstitious about passing 9, therefore passing Beethoven. But if we talk about the traditional 9, I love 8 of the 9, and there's just one I cannot get myself into. And I'm not going to say which one, but it's.
Let me guess. Let me guess. I would guess 6.
Wrong. And
okay. Okay.
And I mention this for the following reason, that I love almost everything Wagnerian. There's just one opera I don't cotton to. I adore and worship everything Verdian except for one opera. I always find it interesting that even in these magnificent, peerless composers and artists, and I'm not saying that I'm any guide to what's great, but that sometimes we just don't quite connect to one bit of their output, no matter how great I could acknowledge on paper that work is. And I try every year to go back to those, the one Mahler symphony, the one Verdi opera, and the one Wagner opera, and relearn them afresh as if I didn't know them. And I'm getting closer with the Verdi opera than I am with the Mahler symphony, and definitely not that Wagner opera, which I just cannot get through. But all the rest, I mean, the Ring, Tannhäuser, Lohengrin, Parsifal, I loved them, and you know, everything about them. And Flying Dutchman, and so I'm sort of narrowing down for you which one it is. And I'm not talking about Die Feen or Das Liebesverbot, the early works.
No, it's one of the central canon. I know
one of the central canon.
I think I guessed what it is.
Yeah, probably. But nonetheless, do you, and this applies to wine, it applies to food, it applies to taste in general. If there's something that is commonly accepted as a masterpiece or a definitive wine, and you just don't connect, how do you approach that thing? Do you feel that you got to try to fix it, or it's okay not to like it, or what?
Oh, well, I mean, as a critic, which I was until I retired in 2019, I have to be able to put aside my personal preferences as much as I can and judge the product that I'm tasting on the basis of how good is it for what it intends to be. Mm-hmm. And, you know, yeah, there's a lot of pieces of music like that. I may not like some of the pieces that Baird wrote, but I love the great pieces. I may not like some of the pieces that Ligeti wrote, but I love Ligeti, and I love his sense of humor and the way he plays with music. But I can't, you know, I'm with you. There's certain things that I just don't get. And with wine, it's just a matter of, okay, does this do what it intends to do? And if it does, then I give it its due, even though if it's up to me, I'm not going to open a bottle for myself or for my guests. I will choose something else.
So
Does that
here's
answer
a
your question?
question.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm picking up my bottle of Alsatian Pinot Blanc.
Yeah.
I have a question about this wine, but another one first. A social question. Let's say you're inviting people over for dinner and they say, well, not for Harvey Steiman, but in general, let me bring a wine. What do you want, a white or a red? What if the wine they bring, lovely though it might be, just doesn't go with the food that you're preparing? What do you do with the wine that they bring?
Well, first of all, I would tell them I have some wines. They know I have a cellar, and I'm going to pull wines out of the cellar for them. And they usually, I don't remember anybody asking that. And if someone brings a wine as a house gift, it's a house gift. It's not necessarily to be open. Up to the host. Hey, let's open that tonight. Let's have fun. That's fine. But if I already have some wines lined up, and particularly if it's an older wine, it's just got to shake it up coming to dinner. Maybe it's better to let that settle for a while before we drink it. I have also had groups get together where we each bring a bottle of wine, and usually to go with dinner, and we'll deliver it to whoever's home it's going to be at, and let it settle down, let it get chilled the way it should, so that we can enjoy it at its best. But no, it's you're not obliged to open a wine someone brings you unless you solicit it for that purpose.
Okay. Because I've occasionally found myself in an awkward situation where someone says, I brought you such a nice wine. How come we're not drinking it? And I usually reply that I selected wines to go with the food that I prepared.
Yeah.
But then what I do, if I like the person, is I'll say, I'll invite you back. And next time I'll make food that goes with the wine that you brought.
Yeah.
And
or
then
even more generally, let's get together another time and we'll open it and drink it together. Yeah.
Now, then there's the question of where do you stand on the notion of wine as cocktails before a meal?
If you like it, go for it. Actually, I don't mind drinking an aromatic white wine, a Riesling, a Gewürztraminer, or something like that, before a meal. Even a rosé, especially, is lovely all by itself. But if it's a wine that will be at its best if you have it with food,
yeah,
I'll try to have it with food. On the other hand, drinking a good glass of wine is drinking a good glass of wine. I'm not going to turn down that opportunity, but I'm not going to force it on anybody either.
No. I, before a meal, tend not to drink anything alcoholic because I find that it corrupts my palate. I only want to consume a certain amount of alcohol at a given sitting, and therefore I don't drink cocktails at all. I don't get cocktails because to me they're just heavy alcohol and flavorings on my palate before the meal with the wine. So I tend not to do that. The final question, and then I have to get going and you get to go hear music in Aspen, is
guess who's singing tonight?
Who? I can't guess. You tell me.
Go ahead. Do your thing first. Right. I'll tell you.
I noticed that when you open your wine, it was the screw top, and my Alsatian wine is the screw top.
Yeah.
There are, in other words, no cork. And there are some countries such as Austria and New Zealand that have done that for a while. But I realized that both of us are drinking French wine today, and we both had screw tops. Talk about the genesis, and is it a good idea? And what do we lose, if anything, by abandoning cork? And what do we lose, or perhaps environmentally, do in adding screw tops?
I have been wrestling with that question for a long time. I am a champion of, I like to call them twist offs instead of screw tops, because I think it has a bad connotation. As the wine industry grew, it made greater demands on the world's limited cork forests. And as a result, the quality of corks that were not the most expensive corks started to fall off. And a cork had the unfortunate side effect of it can develop something called corkiness. TCA, it's a chemical that develops in the cork, a relatively small percentage. But at one point in our tasting room at Wine Spectator, we were noticing 5 to 7% of the wines had been spoiled by the cork. And the reason we knew that is we had a second bottle. You could open the second bottle was fine. And this one was bad. So we knew it was that this was an issue. It's less of an issue today because the cork industry finally responded to that issue and changed its practices, and now has gotten that down to about 1%, half of 1%. And it even makes some corks because of certain treatments that it guarantees 100%. If it spoils your bottle, we'll pay you for it. So the cork industry's gotten better about it. But for a long time, and there are other things about cork too, is if you want to keep a bottle for a long time, sooner or later, a cork may not be perfect and it will allow more air more oxygen into the bottle than you might want. And the result, it starts tasting like sherry. Sherry is great, but you don't want your great white Burgundy tasting like a sherry. The great thing, the first and best solution was twist off, because it isn't the metal top, it's the little piece of plastic vinyl. It's a polyvinyl. It goes that seals the top of the bottle, and the top just holds it down in place. And it's a perfect seal. I go into the science behind it, but basically that bottle will never have a problem with off flavors because of what was on it. Now, a couple of things happen when you have a perfect seal. Some of the greatest wines of the world have been stored in perfect conditions with perfect corks and wines from the late 19th century were still drinking beautifully 10, 20 years ago that had been stored like that. That was a rare, but you take 12 bottles out of a case, each bottle is going to be different than the others. With one of these caps, each bottle is going to be the same. For a long time, people said, no, the wines don't develop. I've had Australian Chardonnays, New Zealand Sauvignon Blancs that have been stored for 5, 7, 10, 20, 25 years, red wines as well, that have developed all those secondary characteristics you want. What they have not developed is oxidation. And I love it that they didn't.
And red wines also deal with twist off, or is it a white wine, more of a white wine thing for younger wines?
In Australia, they use them for everything.
Okay. To my knowledge, most of the cork in the world comes from Portugal and Sardinia. Are there any other sources?
Spain has some cork forests.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing major.
So Harvey, oh, there you are. We got the letter H for a moment, but there you are back.
Yeah, that was an incoming call that I ignored.
Okay. As we wind up, there are just a couple of other things I want to ask you or talk about. One of them is, I have very dear, beloved friends in England who I miss, and they have a beautiful winery in France, and they have a beautiful cellar, but they're not ostentatious at all, and they're very open to all kinds of wines and tastes, and we've had very good tastings together in different parts of the world. And one time I was visiting their home with my mother, who was not particularly into wine or knowledgeable about wine. And my friend Ian opened a bottle of wine and asked me if I could recognize it and when it might be from. And I'll tell you in a moment where it was from, but I want to ask you, Harvey, what is the oldest wine or alcoholic beverage you've tasted?
I have had, I can't tell you the exact vintage, but I have had a 17th century Madeira. And of course, that's a oxidized wine to begin with. So it was absolutely magnificent when I had it maybe 20 or 30 years ago. As far as a table wine, I think the oldest wine I had was one of those 1875 clarets that were stored at Glamis Castle in Scotland. In perfect conditions. That was what I was referring to before. And it was with a bunch of very rich collectors who allowed me to taste along with it, so I wrote about it.
So for context, 1875 was the year that Carmen premiered in Paris at the comedy at the Opera Comique. My friend Ian opened a wine, a Madeira, that was from 1823, and I had no context to compare it to anything else. It was fascinating on its own. And my very sweet mother, who knows nothing about wine, said, 1823, Fred, was that a good year?
And you have to say, where?
I don't know. My knowledge goes back maybe to the 1940s, but not the 1820s.
Yeah. I couldn't tell you.
Harvey, it was wonderful to visit with you, and thank you. And I think we've introduced our listeners. I meant to mention, by the way, that you and I know someone in common, Brian Jade, who was my guest in January, who's an opera tenor who grew up in the food world and is very knowledgeable about wine. And I know you've tasted with him, and I know him, and so I wrote a Brian is watching today. Yeah, and but anyway, thank you, and my best, your wife Carol. And I do hope to see you on the other side of this. Can we bring wine to the baseball park?
You have to sneak it in.
Never mind. We didn't say it.
or we could save it till after the game.
Save it till after, and we'll have Baltimore crab, and then we'll go out and have Virginia wines. How about that in Baltimore? Does that work for you?
Well, whatever works.
Okay.
Whatever works.
Thank you so much.
Thank you too. We're off tonight to hear a wonderful concert conducted by Nick McGeegan, and Julia Bullock is singing the Hindu songs. Which are,
if you talk to her, please give her my regards. She was my 4th guest on this series back in May of last year. She's a wonderful artist.
She's a wonderful artist. I just love every